I was 11 days postpartum the first time my mother-in-law hit me. 8:14 in the evening, according to the timestamp on the video that was already recording in my back pocket, because I have spent my entire career learning that some rooms need a witness even when nobody else in the room believes they do. I count things for a living. Money mostly. Where it comes from, where it goes, and what people tell themselves about the difference. I did not expect to spend a Tuesday night in October counting the seconds between the sound of my daughter crying and the sound of my mother-in-law's hand against my face. This is not a story about a slap. That's just where it starts. This is a story about a woman who spent 31 years believing the family checkbook was hers to close whenever she felt unappreciated, and what happened when she found out it wasn't. Welcome back to Calm Revenge Tales, the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and family learns that boundaries have a price. If stories about dignity, documents, and consequences are your thing, drop a comment and subscribe, because this one has a paper trail that took me 4 months to fully understand, and I'm going to walk you through every page of it. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I'm a forensic accountant, which means I spend my working life doing one specific thing, reading numbers until they confess. Divorces, embezzlement, disputed estates. People lie in conversation constantly, effortlessly, sometimes without even registering it as a lie. Numbers don't have that luxury. A dollar is either there or it isn't. A transfer either happened on the 14th or it happened on the 17th, and no amount of crying in a deposition changes the date on the wire. I met my husband at a fundraising gala I was auditing, which is either the least romantic origin story you've heard or the most fitting one, depending on how this ends. His name was Daniel. He built furniture, mostly beautiful joinery work, the kind where you can't see a single nail. I used to tell him he and I did the same job. He made things fit together so well you couldn't see the seams. I made sure the seams were exactly where people said they were. His father, Walter, built the family's real estate holding company from a single duplex in 1979 into something that, by the time I entered the family, owned 11 properties across 2 counties. Walter was quiet in the way that made a room quiet around him. He liked me immediately, for reasons I understood only much later. He used to say, over coffee, that I was the first person who'd married into the family and asked to see the depreciation schedules before the wedding instead of after. He meant it as the highest compliment he had. His wife, Vivian, was a different kind of quiet, the kind that isn't an absence of noise, but a held breath, waiting for the room to owe her something. Vivian ran the family the way some people run a company they've never filed the paperwork for. Everyone reported to her. Everyone paid dues, in time and deference, in showing up to the Sunday dinners she scheduled and never asked about. I paid mine in a specific currency. I was the one who drove Walter to chemo appointments the year his heart started failing before his lungs did, because Daniel worked days and Vivian said hospitals made her feel faint. I was the one who reconciled the rental property books every quarter for free, since you're good with that sort of thing. I was the one 11 days after giving birth, hosting a family dinner in my own home because Vivian had declared, without asking, that the baby needed to be introduced properly, and I was too tired and too stitched together to say no. The emotional arithmetic of that family ran on a simple equation nobody ever wrote down. What I gave was expected, and what I received was a favor. I didn't see the equation clearly until the night I was doing algebra with a handprint still warm on my cheek. Walter died in March, 7 months before my daughter was born. Congestive heart failure, quiet, in his sleep, the kind of death that leaves you almost grateful and entirely unprepared. I remember the exact date because I remember every date that matters, March the 11th, and I remember that Vivian's first phone call that morning wasn't to the funeral home. It was to Daniel, asking whether the business documents were somewhere she could get to them before the lawyers got involved. I didn't think much of it at the time. Grief does strange things to the order people call people in. By October, my daughter, Iris, was 11 days old, and Vivian had appointed herself the arbiter of what a newborn dinner should look like in my house. She brought her own centerpiece. She rearranged my dining chairs before I came downstairs. And when Iris, 11 days old, colicky, exhausted from a world that was 11 days too bright and too loud, began to cry during the toast Vivian was giving about carrying on Walter's legacy, Vivian turned to me, in front of Daniel's sister and her husband and two cousins I barely knew, and said, "Shut her up or get out of my house." It wasn't her house. It was mine. Walter had helped Daniel and me buy it 4 years earlier, a fact Vivian had never once acknowledged out loud, the same way she'd never once acknowledged that the mortgage was in my name too. I said, calmly, that Iris was a newborn and newborns cry, and that if Vivian couldn't tolerate a crying baby at a dinner in her honor, we could reschedule. I did not raise my voice. I have never once raised my voice at that woman, not because I'm naturally gentle, but because I learned a long time ago that calm is not the same thing as weak. My family had confused the two my entire life, and I had stopped correcting them because their confusion was useful to me in ways I hadn't fully cataloged yet. Vivian crossed the dining room in 4 steps and slapped me across the face, hard enough that Iris startled awake against my collarbone and started screaming in earnest. The room went the particular silent that only happens when everyone present has just watched something they can't unknow. My phone was in my back pocket recording because I had started recording every interaction with Vivian 8 months earlier, after an incident with a check that I'll get to. 8:14 p.m. The audio caught everything: the toast, the words "shut her up" or "get out of my house," the sound of the slap itself, sharp and specific, and then 11 seconds of nobody in that room saying a single word to defend me. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I picked up my daughter's blanket from where it had fallen, folded it once, set it on the counter, and asked everyone to leave. That night, after Daniel had apologized 11 times and Vivian had texted him, not me, a message that said Daniel needs to control that woman before she embarrasses this family further, I sat alone in my nursery with my laptop and one single piece of evidence I kept returning to, the way you press a bruise to confirm it's still there. It was a photograph from Walter's 80th birthday, 2 years earlier. In it, Vivian is laughing, her hand on Walter's shoulder, and behind them, taped to the refrigerator, barely visible, is a page of handwriting I hadn't thought about in 2 years, but would think about every day for the next 4 months. The corner of a document with Walter's unmistakable, architect-precise handwriting, and beneath it, a date. I didn't know yet what that document was. I only knew that Walter didn't tape things to refrigerators by accident. For weeks after the slap, I got a call from Marguerite Cho, the estate attorney who'd handled Walter's affairs, asking me to come in alone, she specified, not with Daniel, to review something she called a matter of trustee designation. I remember sitting in her office, Iris asleep in her car seat at my feet, while Marguerite slid a bound document across the desk and told me that Walter had amended his living trust 9 months before he died. 6 weeks before I told anyone I was pregnant. The amendment restructured the holding company's shares. 60%, the controlling interest, was placed in an irrevocable trust for Walter's grandchildren. At that point, hypothetical, since Iris hadn't been conceived yet, which meant Walter had done this purely on faith that we'd have a child eventually. Or perhaps purely on the certainty that Vivian would never manage the properties responsibly enough to preserve anything to inherit. And the trustee named to control that 60%, with full discretionary authority over distributions, property sales, and management decisions, until the youngest grandchild turned 25, was me. Not Daniel. Not Vivian. Me. Marguerite let me read it 3 times before she said another word. I noticed things a normal reader wouldn't have: the specific language in Section 4.2 granting trustee compensation at standard fiduciary rates, the spendthrift clause protecting the trust from creditors and from any beneficiary's spouse in the event of dissolution, which told me Walter had thought about protecting this from Vivian specifically, by name, in the only language a trust document allows a man to use his ex-daughter-in-law's, his wife's, name as a threat. There was a second document in the folder, smaller, handwritten, 3 paragraphs, dated the same day as the amendment. Marguerite said Walter had asked her to hold it separately and give it to me only if I ever became trustee. It began, "Naomi, if you're reading this, it means I was right about the ledgers and right about you. I have watched you balance a family's books for 4 years without ever once asking what was in it for you. That's not weakness. That's the only kind of strength that outlasts money." I read that letter, sitting in a leather chair in a downtown office building, with my sleeping daughter's foot twitching against her car seat strap, and I understood, fully, for the first time, the entire shape of what had happened and what was about to happen. I didn't act on it that day. I folded the letter, put it in my bag, and drove home, and that night I read the full trust document 3 more times, cover to cover, the way I read a set of books before I ever tell a client what I found. Vivian, of course, did not know any of this yet. She spent the 6 weeks after that meeting operating on the assumption that Walter's estate belonged to her outright, the way she'd always operated, as though ownership were a matter of tenure rather than paperwork. Daniel's sister, Renata, started making comments at family gatherings about when the Baycrest property finally sells and what she planned to do with her share. Vivian mentioned, twice in front of me, that she was finally going to update the kitchen, now that things were settled, using the language of a woman spending money that had never legally been hers. Renata came to my house on a Sunday afternoon in late November, unannounced, while Daniel was at the hardware store. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table Vivian had rearranged chairs around 6 weeks earlier, and told me that the family had discussed it and felt that, given everything, it would be cleaner if I simply signed the trustee role over to Vivian. Since it was, in her words, family money, and Walter surely hadn't meant to complicate things this way, and he would have wanted the family to handle it together. I asked her one question. I asked her whether anyone in the family had read the trust document itself, or whether they were all just repeating what Vivian had told them was in it. Renata didn't have an answer. She left 40 minutes later, having said a great deal and told me nothing I didn't already know. That evening, I called Marguerite and told her to send the letter's formal notice to all beneficiaries of the trust's terms, the trustee designation, and the fiduciary boundaries that now governed every property, every distribution. Every dollar that moved through the holding company Walter had spent 40 years building. I did not send the letters in anger. I sent them because a trust that isn't formally noticed to its beneficiaries is a trust that invites exactly the kind of confusion Renata had just tried to weaponize in my kitchen. If you've ever watched people who couldn't spare one afternoon suddenly find all the time in the world when money is involved, you already know where this goes. Stick with me. If you've ever watched people who couldn't spare one afternoon suddenly find all the time in the world the moment money entered the room, you already know exactly where this story is heading. I promise you the confrontation is worth the wait. Hit subscribe now so you don't miss it, and let's keep going. Vivian invited me to Thanksgiving 12 days later. The invitation came through Daniel, phrased carefully, almost sweetly, a chance for the family to come together and celebrate the baby's first holiday. I understood immediately what it actually was. It was a tribunal dressed as a dinner. I accepted. I prepared a folder. The folder contained 4 things: a certified copy of the trust amendment, the handwritten letter, a printed transcript of the 11-second silence from October 8th, timestamped and notarized as a supporting exhibit to a separate matter I'd filed with the state's domestic incident registry, and a single photograph. The one of Walter's 80th birthday, the refrigerator visible behind him, the corner of the very document now sitting in my folder taped where he'd left it for anyone paying attention. I arrived at Vivian's house knowing more about her financial position than she did. Marguerite had confirmed, in the weeks prior, that Vivian's personal accounts had drawn down significantly since Walter's death, a fact that would matter enormously in about 90 minutes. Dinner proceeded the way these dinners do. Vivian gave a toast about moving forward as a family that was, in substance, a eulogy for a version of control she hadn't yet admitted she'd lost. Renata raised a glass to new beginnings for the properties. Someone, I believe it was a cousin who had said perhaps 4 words to me in 4 years, actually used the phrase he would have wanted us all to share, about a man whose signature on a legal document said otherwise, in writing, filed with the county recorder. When the toasts finished, Vivian looked at me, expectant, the way you look at someone you assume is about to surrender. I asked for the floor. She gave it to me generously because she believed she was watching a woman about to hand something back. I opened the folder. I named the first document, the Trust Amendment, dated 7 months before Iris was born, and read the operative clause aloud, slowly. The 60% controlling interest, the trustee designation, my name. Printed in a font that doesn't care who's uncomfortable. I named the second document, the Spendthrift Clause, and explained, in plain language, what it meant that Walter had written protection against Vivian specifically into a legal instrument 9 months before he died. The room went soft first, a kind of confused, deflating quiet. Then it went emotional, Renata's voice cracking on the word cruel. Then it went loud, Vivian standing, her chair scraping the floor the exact way it had scraped the night of the slap. Then, when I did not raise my voice to match hers, when I simply waited, it went threatening. Vivian said I would regret this, that I had turned this family against itself, that I would be sorry. I answered each escalation with a quieter sentence than the one before it. I have found, professionally and personally, that volume is a tell. People raise their voices when the facts stop being on their side. Then I named the third document. I read, aloud, one line from Walter's letter. That's not weakness. That's the only kind of strength that outlasts money, and I watched something move across Vivian's face that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with recognition. She had known her husband. She had simply never believed he'd meant any of it as a warning about her. And then I laid the photograph on the table. Walter's 80th birthday. Vivian's hand on his shoulder, laughing. The refrigerator behind them, and on it, barely visible unless you knew exactly what you were looking for, the corner of the very document now sitting between the wine glasses. I didn't explain it. It didn't need explaining. Everyone at that table understood, in the same instant, that Walter had been quietly preparing this for 2 years, in plain sight, and none of them had been paying enough attention to notice. It was Renata, of everyone, whose face changed last and most completely. She looked at the photograph for a long moment, then at me, and said, quietly, that she hadn't known, that she wouldn't have said what she said in my kitchen if she'd known. I acknowledged it. I did not absolve her. Knowing and not knowing were both choices she'd made without asking a single question first, and I've spent my career learning that not asking is its own kind of signature on the page. Vivian did not apologize. I hadn't expected her to. I stood, closed the folder, and, before I left the table, said the only sentence I'd prepared in advance. You told me to shut her up or get out of your house. Tonight, I'm doing neither. I'm just making sure everyone finally understands whose house it actually is. I drove home with Iris asleep in her car seat and didn't look back once. In the 4 months after that dinner, the practical resolution settled the way these things do once the paperwork does the talking instead of the people. As trustee, I authorized the sale of one property, the Baycrest duplex, to fund a structured settlement that paid Vivian a monthly distribution from the trust's income, not ownership, income, the difference between being cared for and being in charge, a distinction she is still, as far as I know, adjusting to. Renata's share remained intact. She'd earned that much by asking the one honest question she'd asked all year, even if it came a day late. The domestic incident filing resulted in a formal mediated agreement requiring no contact between Vivian and me outside supervised family events, which is a legal document's polite way of saying I will never again be alone in a room with that woman while holding my daughter. The photograph now lives in a frame in Iris's nursery, not as a trophy, but because it's the last picture of Walter laughing, and because I think a person should grow up seeing evidence that someone loved her before she could remember it. The letter is in a safe deposit box, though I know the line inside it by heart, the way you know the exact wording of a verdict you were there for. I don't think of any of this as revenge, and if that surprises you, I understand why. Revenge is something you go looking for. All I did was stop paying a debt I never actually agreed to carry, the debt of being useful in exchange for being tolerated. I closed the account. That's not a metaphor. I mean that literally. It's on a balance sheet with my signature on it. The act I'm proudest of has nothing to do with Vivian at all. Using the trust's discretionary authority, I established a scholarship fund in Walter's name for first-generation students studying accounting or finance, the kind of unglamorous, invisible work that keeps families and companies from quietly falling apart while everyone's looking somewhere else. He would have liked that far more than he'd have liked anything I did at that dinner table. I think he built this whole quiet mechanism 2 years in advance, precisely so that someone in this family would eventually do something with his life's work besides fight over it. Here's the only thing I'll say plainly, because I think it's the whole of it. The people who taught me my calm was a weakness were the same people who never once checked whether it was a ledger, patiently recording every entry, waiting for the balance to come due. If this reminded you that quiet people keep the receipts and that boundaries are allowed even with blood, take that as your sign. Update what needs updating. Tell someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.